Hello and welcome to So What You're Saying Is. I'm Peter Whittle. Now, we are certainly living in times where all masculinity appears to be toxic. Certainly men appear to be attacked from many different sides. But what does it really mean to be a man in the 21st century? How can men lead meaningful lives? Well, that's the subject of a new book, The 7 Ages of Man, How to Live a Meaningful Life. The author is my guest today, James Innes-Smith, who is a journalist for such publications as The Guardian, The Spectator, The Times, numerous publications. Thank you very, very much for coming in, James. I found this fascinating and timely, but I wonder why did you decide to write it now?
Well, actually, it's been quite a long time in the making, actually. It's gone through various stages. At first, it was called The War on Masculinity, and that was I came up with the idea about 2.5 years ago, just around the time that Jordan Peterson was sort of making headway.
That's right.
And it was very much of its time, I think, that there was all that stuff going on after Me Too, and I think gradually it just sort of shifted, really, as that sort of blew over a bit. And I thought, well, let's broaden it out a bit to talk about, well, you know, what can men do to improve their lot, rather than merely focusing on how things are going wrong or how masculinity has become toxic and all these sort of negative things. How can men actually live more fulfilling lives, and what do they need to do in order to achieve that?
But you see, yes, and therefore it's being very constructive and positive. But in a way, why do you think we arrived at that situation? I mean, when you say everything has been negative, obviously it appears to me that it has. But why did we arrive at that situation? How?
I think we were looking for blame. I think Me Too was certainly a very important moment, but I think it was a very specific moment to do with actual people doing actual harm. And I think what happened is it broadened out. It became very politicized, and I think the feminist sort of side got on board, and it all became a bit sort of blamey, and men as a sort of entity suddenly were under the microscope, and not very flatteringly. I mean, I don't go along with this idea that poor old men, you know, they're under attack necessarily, because I think, you know, some of that stuff about Weinstein, you know, it needed to be called out, and it was very timely, and I'm glad that it was. But I think what happened, it sort of turned into something much more toxic, to use a phrase, which I think has separated the sexes. It's formed a barrier, which I think has opened up and has divided the genders, the sexes, and I think it's very sad.
Do you feel it from men you speak to, friends, whatever? Do you feel that they feel they're in crisis?
Yes, quietly though. They don't shout about it. I think there's a lot of that sort of quiet desperation amongst a lot of men, of all ages actually. We tend to think about young men and mental health issues and all that, but I think middle-aged men certainly, and older men, you know, the generations have become quite split, I think. And I think in the book I try to break it down into all the different sections of life. So I've got, you know, we start with childhood, we go to adolescence, middle age, I talk about work, and then old age and legacy. So each act of life, I suppose, has its own challenges. So I wanted to try and, you know, distill those and give men an idea of how they can sort of navigate their way through all the trials and tribulations.
It's based actually on Shakespeare's 7 Ages of Man, obviously the title suggests. But as you were saying there, it's actually sort of almost, it's like a hybrid of a self-help book, would you call it? That's a very derogatory thing on the whole, isn't it?
Yes, I suppose it is. It's more of a manifesto or something that you can refer to. It doesn't offer miracle cures. It's not in that respect, but it's more of a sort of a gentle reminder of all the sort of things that we have clung to in the past, institutions such as marriage and the nuclear family, things which have now in themselves become politicized, which were not political at all.
So how can you explain, when you say they've been politicized, give us an example of that.
Well, for instance, I think something like marriage or the nuclear family, for instance, have very much become the domain of the right for some reason. That, you know, it's thought of as being reactionary if you stand up for the nuclear family or for traditional marriage, whereas that was never the case before. It was it was a sort of good template by which you could live your life, and if you decided it wasn't for you, then that was fine. But I think it's important to realise that you can be for something, but not necessarily be against other things. So you can be for traditional marriage or the nuclear family, but that doesn't mean you hate single mothers or you have it in for same-sex marriage. And I think the problem has been that if you take a side, you're automatically against the other side, which I think in itself is very difficult, because it means people can't stand up for traditions or foundations which for centuries have been the building blocks of our society.
But when you say they've been politicized, it's not, it just didn't happen kind of organically. You could say it was deliberate, surely. I mean, when you say you said that people are not necessarily put immediately into opposition with single-sex marriages, but that's the way it's been framed, isn't it?
Yes, I think there was a case today actually of a chap who a Christian man who said online or something that he was for the best way to bring up children was within the nuclear family, and he got pilloried and he's lost his job and various, he's been sort of demonized for holding that position. Interestingly, he never at any point said, "I'm against same-sex marriage." He said it was, within his religion, these were the tenets of his religion. That doesn't necessarily mean he's going to go out and be cruel to same-sex couples or single mothers. So we've got muddled up with positions which there should be no problem with holding, which have suddenly become tied up with sort of right-wing thinking or left-wing thinking, which there was no need for that, I think. It was all of my perceptions over the past three decades or so, that even though one doesn't want to think in these left-right terms, it was the left on the whole who were sort of attacking these things, actually. I mean, that when they were standing up for certain minority rights, it was more about the attack on the other things that mattered. Would you agree with that? Yes, I think. Well, I suppose they wanted to bring about equality, and in order to do that, they sort of got into the mindset that you had to somehow undermine the predominant culture, because it felt a bit like sour grapes that maybe that predominant culture had it good for too long, and maybe it was time for a change, and that, why shouldn't minorities become more of a dominant factor? Which I kind of understand, but it's a mean-spirited way of finding equality. And I think equality of opportunity, and that we allow people to flourish in whatever field they want to, and in whichever sort of lifestyle they want to. That has to be as far as it goes. To then start to criticize or critique the dominant culture feels to me, as you say, like it's another toxic way of dealing with something which should be about bringing people together. Do you think that this kind of void, you talk in the book, because you relate individual lives to the culture outside, of course. Do you think that the void in meaning, which many people might not even be conscious of, they might be unconsciously aware of it, is it mostly to do with the decline or absence of religion, do you think, now? I think that certainly added to the problem, for sure. Yeah. And even if you, I mean, I talk about it in the book. Even if you aren't, if you haven't bought into the Christian faith, we are imbued by its values as a society. It's been the foundation of many of our institutions and our moral sensibilities for a long time. I mean, for centuries. And I think when you remove that fundamental basis, people become confused, they become lost, they forget about what those foundations were and why they were important, and suddenly people are feeling unmoored from things which only very recently were considered, as I said before, they weren't political at all, they were just merely the foundations from which we could live our lives.
How would you say, James, what has given meaning to your life?
Well, I came very late to marriage, actually, and to family. I've just had a kid.
Last week.
Yes, in middle age, and it's bringing me a lot of joy, which I've always been slightly ambivalent about marriage and family, and I'm absolutely thrilled. It really does suddenly give you a purpose in life beyond the self, and I think that is one of the problems we've had in our society. Is we've become about me rather than the broader society. Sort of radical autonomy took over, I think, probably in the last 30 or 40 years, whereby it was all about the self. Self-fulfillment would bring us happiness, and fulfillment happiness and meaning, which was never going to be the case. I'm still amazed that we follow that path to meaning, because it's proved time and time again throughout generations that it never ends well if you just focus on the self. At the same time, obviously, we've had this sort of move to tribalism, whereby we identify as groups, very sort of tight groups. That, I think, has also made us lose sight of that deeper sense of belonging and culture and society, and that we're all in this together, and that life is fragile. We're all terrified creatures looking for purpose. And if you either go into the self and go, well, it's just about me, and I'm going to achieve what I need, sod everyone else, that's one way. And if you go into the tribal way, that's also destructive, because you're saying, well, it's my tribe, and the other tribes are insignificant. It's about achieving a sense of pride for my little group. Now, Roger Scruton did talk about the little battalions, where which I do find is a good way to live a meaningful life. And that starts with family. It starts in small communities where people are looking out for each other. And again, I think we've lost that sense of looking out for each other in a small scale, but it widens out into the broader community and gives us all a sense of purpose and meaning and coming together.
I think the thing is interesting there, because I feel that you said we've lost it. I mean, I would say that on the part of some people, they positively rejected it.
Yeah.
There's this sort of feeling, particularly you get it in cities,
yes.
Of sort of somehow I am so special that if I anchor myself in one particular place, that somehow is provincial. It's going to restrict me. Do you recognise that as a picture?
Oh, definitely, yes, I do. And there's this sort of terror in cities of bourgeois provincialness. But they forget that actually, if you do go to the country or the village life, okay, it's not as exciting as the city, but it certainly has its benefits in as much as people really do look out for each other. I mean, I've lived sort of half my time in Suffolk on the coast in a very small village, and it's kind of a relief going back there after London, because you feel that you're sort of all there. There's that sense of community, and the word community is chucked around a lot now, but I think it's lost a lot of its meaning, because it's often used to describe vast tracts of, the LGBT community or the BAME community. But I don't think you can make those people into a homogenous community. They are.
Well, they would agree with you, I think. On
yes.
the whole.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you sort of feel as well that some wider sense, as you put it, like feeling passionate about something outside yourself, or in fact, something outside yourself is meaningful to you, whether it's your family or not, do you think it can be achieved by, for example, politics? If you are very, very... I mean, I've always found that it's people who do things very, very well and care about something outside themselves is always a very attractive trait. Do you think politics can do that?
Possibly, if your heart's in the right place.
Yeah.
I'm not one of these people who dismisses all politicians as being sort of psychotic, but I think you can veer off that path quite easily because of the power. But I think if you genuinely want to change the world, I mean, there's not much more meaning than that. I mean, to actually genuinely want to change people's lives for the better, to achieve a more equitable society in a realistic way, not in any sort of utopian way, then I think absolutely. And also what you say about having something outside yourself, even just something as simple as a hobby. I mean, I talk about it in the book. Just have something that you can focus your mind on that takes you out of the self, because we get so tied up in our own needs and wants and desires, and it can drive us mad if we don't have something other than that to focus on.
I mean, so in this, you with each, as you say, you go through childhood, adolescence, relationships, middle age, old age, which I didn't read.
Of course, you'll get that.
No, couldn't bear to. The thing is throughout you give quite practical advice as well. I mean, like you just said, get a hobby. This sort of did remind me rather of Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life. When he said to, basically, was that actually aimed at men? I think it was aimed at people.
It was people, yeah.
But most of his audience was men, I think. Yeah. But it was like clear your room up, wasn't it? It was do those sorts of things before you start telling people what to do.
Yes.
And I mean, would you say, like, for example, to an adolescent, don't give in to, say, Instagram, don't give in to narcissism?
Yeah, I'm quite clear on that, actually. I advise parents just to not give their children, not allow their children onto social media, and to avoid giving them smartphones and pads, because for as long as possible, because I think they need to experience the real world before they start getting tied into the sort of virtual world, which although is on the surface very wide, because you can access the entire world, is very narrow, because you focus down, and kids especially, they start to become very isolated, I think, in a way, and they don't see their friends as much. They don't get outside, they don't breathe the fresh air and explore the world. All those things that kids, I think, is absolutely vital for a healthy upbringing. It all becomes focused on one thing. And I also talk in the book a lot about the sort of coarsening of our popular culture. And I think
yes. I mean, this is terribly important in the adolescent section, actually.
Yes.
Basically, you're saying that this is just a lowering experience. Isn't that right to say?
I think so. Yeah.
What are you talking about there, really?
Well, I just think the sort of garishness of so much popular culture now. It's sort of in your face. It's trying to get your attention. It's effectively shouting at you. And it's a noisy, bright. I mean, I find it very difficult to look at most of it now, especially sort of primetime TV. There's something incredibly disturbingly kind of sinister about it, I find. It's trying to grab your attention in really quite coarse ways. And I advise children, actually, and adolescents to explore the online world, the long-form interviews, the long-form discussions, the Peter Whittle shows, obviously, that sort of thing.
Very flattered by the
in
entry.
The book. But there's so much out there. There's such a rich vein of really thoughtful, decent-minded, honest debate that isn't partisan necessarily, that broadens the mind in a really healthy way. Whereas I think the mainstream has lost sight of that now. I think it's become too self-obsessed in a way. It's too conscious of its own incredibleness, that it feels too important to itself. It's self-important, and it's lost its ability to entertain, inform, all those gentle things which the Rethian structure avowed, which was, it was a sort of selfless way of spreading the news, spreading the word, spreading entertainment, rather than it being a prescribed. This is what you will watch because this is what we think will be, sort of healthy for you. And but it's become very, broadly coarse and unattractive, I think, and I don't think it's healthy for any of us really to look too much of it.
It's the physical narcissism as well that's striking, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, on this Instagram and social media, it's quite extraordinary, isn't it? It's all about the physical.
Yes. Yeah, which of course for vulnerable adolescents is the worst sort of message to be told, that you in order to be liked you have to be attractive, in order to be liked you need to have a certain hairstyle. And I think this goes across popular music as well. I mean, I don't want to sound like a boring old fuddy-duddy, because obviously there's a lot of good stuff out there, but I think there's a cynicism that's taken over a lot of popular culture, which means that bands maybe who are talented and who may need a lot of work to get out there are being denied, whereas a sexy girl who can shake her booty will be sort of, molded to a very sort of generic form of entertainment, which just feels just demoralizing and cynical rather than uplifting. And I think it's that lack of feeling uplifted by the media that I think is so missing, which people crave, actually.
Some people have remarked that the whole woke thing going on at the moment, this sort of cult of woke, which seems to have taken over the culture, has a religious feel about it. I mean, do you think that the people who indulge in kind of the more extreme versions of woke are in fact trying to find some sort of meaning?
Oh, they're hungry. They're hungry for meaning. And I don't have animosity towards them. I feel that they are lacking meaning, and that there isn't a constructive meaning out there for them to latch on to. So obviously, when that doesn't exist, you go to the closest thing, and I don't think it's fulfilling for them. I don't think it's a long-term strategy for finding meaning or purpose, and I think in the end, it's demoralizing and rather sad, frankly.
One thing that's always said about love is that love conquers all. Love gives us meaning. Do you think that's true for men? Do you think that meaning can be got from just simply love? I mean, the way that we look at romantic things now is that we find our soulmate or we find our other half. You hear this all the time. Gives us meaning. Do you think that is a successful aspiration for men to have?
I think it is, but I think it's also, again, it's been over-romanticized and over-sexualized, a lot of it, so that I think, for instance, I talk in the book about online dating and how that's sort of coarsening the whole coming together of men and women, and the entitlement and the too much choice, and all these things I think are moving away from that fundamental ability of love to bring us meaning. And I think actually love is a very delicate balance of selflessness and giving. And I think the selflessness thing, which comes with marriage, which comes with a deep, committed relationship, that is so important. But it's been forgotten about, I think, in this selfish society. Selflessness can offer us huge amounts of fulfillment and meaning, and yet we rarely talk about it as a way of meeting that sort of need for love. But that it takes sacrifice in order to find true love, and we don't like sacrifice.
I think people, as you say, feel entitled, feel it's their due. But also, you hear people say, "Oh, I'm spiritual." You talk about the dating game. This is one of the old, I'm a spiritual person. Yeah. So what actually do you mean, spirit? What do you mean? And they've got this hazy idea. What it actually comes down to is they think about themselves a lot.
Exactly. Have you ever been on a yoga retreat? I mean, it's...
I have, actually.
Yeah. For all their talk of oneness and spirituality. I've often found, I'm going to lose a lot of people here, but I've found some, not all obviously, but some of that crowd, I think, are totally self-absorbed. And it's very ironic because their entire raison d'etre through yoga is to get beyond the self. But I think there's a lot of vanity there and narcissism. That whole yoga speak, I think, it feels a bit like woke speak to me. It's a kind of meaningless jumble of words that sound interesting, but actually don't mean anything. And of course, if you press them on what they actually mean by their spirituality, they'll run a mile if you mention the word religion, because they can't, to be truly spiritual, you need to commit your life to something and believe in it wholeheartedly. I think what happens with the spiritual lot you're talking about is they pick and choose, have a bit of yoga here, a bit of Buddhism there. Obviously not Christianity, because that's old and boring and what mum and dad used to do. So Christianity is usually the last thing on people's mind. But it's a matter of picking and choosing things that make them feel important, or it's a sort of virtue signal in a way, I think.
Totally absent of judgment as well.
Yeah.
You can't discriminate or make any form of judgment.
No, of course.
That's the route to success. I think it's fascinating. I mean, just on a lighter note, to me, James, I'm going to be 60 in a few weeks' time. What should I be doing, according to this?
Well, you're not in the old age camp.
I'm teetering, aren't I?
Yeah, well, 66 is apparently, that's where I started. 66 is the official when you can pick up your pension and you become a senior citizen officially. I think that's probably going to go up actually as our time spans increase. But I think as we enter the autumn years, it's important not to get set in our ways. I think a lot of older people become grumpy and resentful because they look back on their life and think, God, what have I actually achieved, or what did it all mean? And rather than being grateful for what they've got or what you've had or the incredible experiences that you've had, you tend to feel disappointed and let down. I think that often also happens, I talk about this in the middle years as well, that midlife crisis point where you think, what the hell is this all about? What have I done? What have I achieved? And you look back at the vast shipwreck of your life's esteems, to quote John Clare, the poet, and you think, God, what was that? And I think that can also happen in an older age as well, and we have to really watch for it, because it can make us bitter and twisted and resentful. We start to fall out with our loved ones. We've all seen the bitter old men sitting on park benches shouting at ducks. They're turning over their lives, and they're not grateful for what they've achieved. We don't need massive achievements to feel a sense of well-being at the end of our lives. We need to know that we've treated other people with respect. We've put other people's needs before our own. We've been selfless. We've loved. We've given. We've been generous. All these things, they're not massive achievements necessarily. It's not curing world hunger, and it's not about the incredible journeys that we've made on traveling and all the sexual conquests and the experiences in that. All that stuff, when you're on your deathbed, doesn't even cross your mind. It's how you've been with other people and what you're leaving to the world.
Well, I think what is quite timely about this, actually, is we are now, as this interview is going out, in another lockdown, and this is the sort of time where people have been thinking about this kind of thing. What is this all about? Because they've been stripped to a great extent, haven't they, of the kind of distractions.
Yes.
So it's a good time to read your book.
Yeah.
It's the 7 Ages of Man: How to Live a Meaningful Life. It's out now, isn't it?
Out now.
So you can get it on Amazon.
Yeah.
Thank you very, very much, James. All
Thank
the
you,
very
Peter.
best for it, and I hope it does well. It's an interesting book.
Great.
Thank you
So
very
much.
much. That's it for this week on So What You're Saying Is. We will be back next week. In the meantime, please don't forget to subscribe, won't you? Thanks very much. Bye.